The Black Death was one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, peaking in Europe between 1348 and 1350. It is widely thought to have been an outbreak of plague caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, an argument supported by recent forensic research, although this view has been challenged by a number of scholars. Thought to have started in China, it traveled along the Silk Road and had reached the Crimea by 1346. From there, probably carried by oriental rat fleas residing on the black rats that were regular passengers on merchant ships, it spread throughout the Mediterranean and Europe. The Black Death is estimated to have killed 60 of Europe's population. You're abusing the world's population from an estimated 450 million to between 350 and 370 million in 1400. This has been seen as having created a series of religious, social, and economic upheavals, which had profound effects on the course of European history. It took 150 years for Europe's population to recover. The plague returned at various times, killing more people until it left Europe in the 19th century. Let's overview the disease. There have been 3 major outbreaks of plague. The plague of Justinian in the 6th and 7th centuries is the first known attack on record and marks the first firmly recorded pattern of bubonic plague. From historical descriptions, as much as 40% of the population of Constantinople died from the plague. Modern estimates suggest half of Europe's population was wiped out before the plague disappeared in the 700s. After 750, major epidemic diseases did not appear again in Europe until the Black Death of the 14th century. The third pandemic hit China in the 1890s and devastated India, but was confined to limited outbreaks in the West. 4. The Black Death originated in or near China and spread by way of the Silk Road or by ship. 4 is by ship, intervals with varying virulence and mortality until the 18th century. 6 on its return in 1603, for example, the plague killed 38,000 Londoners. 7. Other notable 17th century outbreaks were the Italian Plague of 1629-1631 and the Great Plague of Seville 1641 and the Great Plague of Seville 1665, 1666, 8 and the Great Plague of Vienna 1679. There is some controversy over the identity of the disease, but in its virulent form, after the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720-17, 22, the Great Plague of 1738, which hit Eastern Europe, and the Russian Plague of 1770-70, 1772, it seems to have gradually disappeared from Europe. By the early 19th century, the threat of plague had diminished, but it was quickly replaced by a new disease. The Asiatic cholera was the first of several cholera pandemics to sweep through Asia and Europe during the 19th and 20th centuries. The 14th century eruption of the Black Death had a drastic effect on Europe's population, irrevocably changing the social structure. It was arguably a serious blow to the Catholic Church and resulted in widespread persecution of minorities such as Jews, foreigners, beggars, and lepers. The uncertainty of daily survival has been seen as creating a general mood of morbidity, influencing people to live for the moment, as illustrated by Giovanni Boccaccio in the Decameron, 1353. Now the question is, who gave the name plague or Black Death? Naming medieval people called the catastrophe of the 14th century either the Great Pestilence or the Great Plague writers, contemporary to the plague. Writers contemporary to the plague refer to the event as the Great Mortality. Swedish and Danish chronicles of the 16th century describe the events as black, for the first time not to describe the late-stage sign of the disease, in which the sufferer's skin would blacken due to subepidermal hemorrhages, purpura, and the extremities would darken with gangrene. Acral necrosis, as the term is more likely to refer to black in the sense of glum, lugubrious, or dreadful as to denote the terribleness and gloom of the events. The German physician and medical writer Justus Hecker suggested that a mistranslation of the Latin atra mors, terrible or black death, had occurred in Scandinavia when he described the catastrophe in 1832, in his publication Der Schwarze Tod im Vierzehnten Jahrhundert. The work was translated into English the following year, and under the influence of the cholera epidemic of that time, the Black Death in the 14th century gained widespread attention, which coined the term Schwarzer Tod and Black Death in the German and English-speaking worlds, respectively. Second question is how plagues migrate from one place to another. Populations in crisis in Europe. The medieval warm period ended sometime towards the end of the 13th century, bringing the Little Ice Age and harsher winters with reduced harvests. In Northern Europe, new technological innovations such as the heavy plow and the three-field system were not as effective in clearing new fields for harvest as they were in the Mediterranean, because the north had poor, clay-like soil. Food shortages and rapidly inflating prices were a fact of life for as much as a century before the plague. Wheat, oats, hay, and consequently livestock were all in short supply. Their scarcity resulted in malnutrition, which increases susceptibility to infections due to weakened immunity. In the autumn of 1314, heavy rains began to fall, which were the start of several years of cold and wet winters. The already weak harvests of the north suffered and the 7-year famine ensued. In the years 1315 to 1317, a catastrophic famine, known as the Great Famine, struck much of northwest Europe. It was arguably the worst in European history, perhaps reducing the population by more than 10. The plague disease, generally thought to be caused by Yersinia pestis, is enzootic, commonly present in populations of fleas carried by ground rodents, including marmots, in various areas including Central Asia, Kurdistan, Western Asia, Northern India, and Uganda. Nestorian graves dating to 1330, 9 near Lake Isakyul in Kyrgyzstan have inscriptions referring to plague, and recent investigations by the Russian archaeologist Chulsin show a high incidence rate and are thought by many epidemiologists to mark the outbreak of the epidemic from which they could easily have spread to China and India. In October 2010, medical geneticists confirmed that the plague came from China. In China, the 13th century Mongol conquest disrupted spread of the Black Death in Europe farming and trading, and led to widespread famine starting in 1330, one with plague arriving soon after. The population dropped from approximately 120 to 60 million. The 14th century plague killed an estimated 25 million Chinese and other Asians during the 15 years before it entered Constantinople in 1347. The disease may have traveled along the Silk Road with Mongol armies and traders, or it could have come via ship. By the end of 1346, reports of plague had reached the seaports of Europe. India was depopulated. Tartary, Mesopotamia, Syria, Armenia were covered with dead bodies. Plague was reportedly first introduced to Europe at the trading city of Kaffa in the Crimea in 1347. After a protracted siege, during which the Mongol army under Jani Beg was suffering the disease, they catapulted the infected corpses over the city walls to infect the inhabitants. The Genoese traders fled, taking the plague by ship into Sicily and the south of Europe once it spread north. Whether or not this hypothesis is accurate, it is clear that several existing conditions such as war, famine, and weather contributed to the severity of the Black Death. Now, how the plague outbreak in European countries. There appear to have been several introductions into Europe. It reached Sicily in October 1340, 7 carried by 12 Genoese galleys, where it rapidly spread all over the island. Galleys from Kaffa reached Genoa and Venice in January 1348, but it was the outbreak in Pisa a few weeks later that was the entry point to northern Italy. Towards the end of January, one of the galleys expelled from Italy arrived in Marseille. From Italy, the disease spread northwest across Europe, striking France, Spain, Portugal, and England by June 1348, then turned and spread east through Germany and Scandinavia from 1348 to 1348 to 1348 to 1350. It was introduced in Norway in 1349 when a ship landed at Askøy, then proceeded to spread to Bjørgvin, modern Bergen, but never reached Iceland. Finally, it spread to western Russia in 1351. The plague spared some parts of Europe, including the Kingdom of Poland and isolated parts of Belgium and the Netherlands. How the disease outbreak in Middle East. The plague struck various countries in the Middle East during the pandemic, leading to serious depopulation and permanent change in both economic and social structures. As it spread to Western Europe, the disease also entered the region from southern Russia. By autumn 1347, the plague reached Alexandria in Egypt, probably through the port's trade with Constantinople and ports on the Black Sea. During 1347, the disease traveled eastward to Gaza and north along the eastern coast to cities in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine, including Ashkelon, Acre, Jerusalem, Sidon, Damascus, Homs, and Aleppo. In 1349, the disease reached Antioch. The city's residents fled to the north, most of them dying during the journey, but the infection had been spread to the people of Asia Minor. Mecca became infected in 1349. During the same year, records show the city of Mosul suffered a massive epidemic, and the city of Baghdad experienced a second round of the disease. In 1351, Yemen experienced an outbreak of the plague. This coincided with the return of King Mujahid of Yemen from imprisonment in Cairo. His party may have brought the disease with them from Egypt. What are the symptoms of plague? Contemporary accounts of the plague are often varied or imprecise. The most commonly noted symptom was the appearance of buboes, or gavaciolos, in the groin, the neck, and armpits, which oozed pus and bled when opened. Boccaccio's description is graphic. In men and women alike, it first betrayed itself by the emergence of certain tumors in the groin or armpits, some of which grew as large as a common apple, others as an egg. The two said parts of the body this deadly gavacciolo soon began to propagate and spread itself in all directions indifferently, after which the form of the malady began to change, black spots or livid making their appearance in many cases on the arm or the thigh or elsewhere, now few and large, now minute and numerous, as the gavacciolo had been and still was an infallible token of approaching death. Such also were these spots on whomsoever they showed themselves. Ziegler comments that the only medical detail that is questionable is the infallibility of approaching death. As if the bubo discharges, recovery is possible. This was followed by acute fever and vomiting of blood. Most victims died within 2 to 7 days after infection. David Herlihy identifies another potential sign of the plague: freckle-like spots and rashes, which could be the result of flea bites. Some accounts, like that of Louis Halligan, a musician in Avignon who died of the plague in 1348, noted a distinct form of the disease which infected the lungs and led to respiratory problems, and which is identified with pneumonic plague. It is said that the plague takes 3 forms. In the first, people suffer an infection of the lungs, which leads to breathing difficulties. Whoever has this corruption or contamination to any extent cannot escape, but will die within 2 days. Another form, a third form in which people of both sexes are attacked in the groin. What are causes of plague? Medical knowledge had stagnated during the Middle Ages, and the most authoritative account at the time came from the medical faculty in Paris in a report to the King of France, which blamed the heavens, a conjunction of 3 planets in 1345, which caused a great pestilence in the air. This report became the first and most widely circulated of a series of plague tracts which sought to give advice to sufferers. That the plague was caused by bad air became the most widely accepted worry. It's important to realize that the word plague had no special significance at this time. But the recurrence of outbreaks during the Middle Ages gave it a unique reputation, and the name has become the medical term. The importance of hygiene was only recognized in the 19th century, and until then it was common that the streets were filthy, with live animals of all sorts around and human fleas and ticks abounding. Any transmissible disease will spread easily in such conditions. One benefit of the Black Death was the establishment of the idea of quarantine in Dubrovnik in 1377, after continuing outbreaks. Let's deep dive in plague. The dominant explanation for the Black Death is the plague theory, which attributes the outbreak to the pathogen responsible for an epidemic that began in southern China in 1865, eventually spreading to India. The investigation of the pathogen that caused the 19th century plague was begun by teams of scientists who visited Hong Kong in 1894, among whom was Alexander Yersin, after whom the pathogen was named Yersinia pestis. The pathogen was named Yersinia pestis. Pestis was usually transmitted, was established in 1898 by Paul Louis Simond, and was found to involve the bites of fleas, whose midguts had become obstructed by replicating eye. Pestis several days after feeding on an infected host. This blockage results in starvation and aggressive feeding behavior by the fleas, which repeatedly attempt to clear their blockage by regurgitation, resulting in thousands of plague bacteria being flushed into the feeding site, infecting the host. The bubonic plague mechanism was also dependent on two populations of rodents, one resistant to the disease, who act as hosts, keeping the disease endemic, and the second who lack resistance. When the second population dies, the fleas move on to other hosts, including people, thus creating a human epidemic. The historian Francis Aidan Gaskett, who had written about the Great Pestilence in 1893, and suggested that it would appear to be some form of the ordinary Eastern or bubonic plague, was able to adopt the epidemiology of the bubonic plague for the Black Death for the second edition in 1908, implicating rats and fleas in the process, and his interpretation was widely accepted for other ancient and medieval epidemics, such as the Justinian plague that was prevalent in the Roman Empire from 541 to 700. The modern bubonic plague has a mortality rate of 30 to 75% and symptoms, including fever of 38, 41 dec, 101, 105 def, headaches, painful aching joints, nausea and vomiting, and a general feeling of malaise. If untreated, of those that contract the bubonic plague, 80 die within 8 days. Pneumonic plague has mortality rate of 90 to 95%. Symptoms include fever, cough, and blood-tinged sputum. As the disease progresses, sputum becomes free-flowing and bright red. Septicemic plague is the least common of the three forms, with a mortality rate close to 100%. Symptoms are high fevers and purple skin patches, purpura due to disseminated intravascular coagulation. In cases of pneumonic and particularly septicemic plague, the progress of the disease is so rapid that there would often be no time for the development of the enlarged lymph nodes that were noted as buboes. Many modern scholars accept that the lethality of the Black Death stemmed from the combination of bubonic and pneumonic plague with other diseases, and warn that every historical mention of pest was not necessarily bubonic plague. Her study of 15th outbreaks, Anne Carmichael states that worms, the pox, fevers, and dysentery clearly accompanied bubonic plague. What are the alternatives explanation of plague disease? This interpretation was first significantly challenged by the work of British bacteriologist J.F.D. Shrewsbury in 1970, who noted that the reported rates of mortality in rural areas during the 14th century pandemic were inconsistent with the modern bubonic plague, leading him to conclude that contemporary accounts were exaggerations. In 1984, zoologist Graham Twigg produced the first major work to directly challenge the bubonic plague theory, and his doubts about the identity of the Black Death have been taken up by a number of authors, including Samuel K. Kahn, Jr., 2002, David Herlihy, 1997, and Susan Scott and Christopher Duncan, 2001. It is recognized that an epidemiological account of the plague is as important as an identification of symptoms, but researchers are hampered by the lack of reliable statistics from this period. Most work has been done on the spread of the plague in England, and even estimates of overall population at the start vary by over 100s, as no census was undertaken between the Domesday Book and 1377. Estimates of plague victims are usually extrapolated from figures for the clergy. In addition to arguing that the rat population was insufficient to account for a bubonic plague pandemic, skeptics of the bubonic plague theory point out that the symptoms of the Black Death are not unique and arguably in some accounts may differ from bubonic plague. That transference via fleas in goods was likely to be of marginal significance, and that the DNA testing may be flawed and have not been repeated elsewhere, despite extensive samples from other mass graves. Other arguments include the lack of accounts of the death of rats before outbreaks of plague between the 14th and 17th centuries, temperatures that are too cold in northern Europe for the survival of fleas, that despite primitive transport systems, the spread of the Black Death was much faster than modern bubonic plague, that mortality rates of the Black Death appear to be very high, that while modern bubonic plague is largely endemic as a rural disease, the Black Death indiscriminately struck urban and rural areas, that the pattern of the Black Death, with major outbreaks in the same areas separated by between 5 and 15 years, differs from modern bubonic plague, which often becomes endemic for decades, flaring up on an annual basis. Wallow complains that all of these authors take it for granted that Simon's infection model, black rat, rat flea, human, which was developed to explain the spread of plague in India, is the only way an epidemic of Yersinia pestis infection could spread, whilst pointing to several other possibilities. A variety of alternatives to the IP pestis have been put forward. Twigg suggested that the cause was a form of anthrax, and N.F. Cantor, 2001, thought it may have been a combination of anthrax and other pandemics. Scott and Duncan have argued that the pandemic was a form of infectious disease that characterized as hemorrhagic plague, similar to Ebola. However, no single alternative solution has achieved widespread acceptance. Many scholars arguing for the I. pestis as the major agent of the pandemic suggest that its extent and symptoms can be explained by a combination of bubonic plague with other diseases, including typhus, smallpox, and respiratory infections. In addition to the bubonic infection, others point to additional septicemic, a type of blood poisoning, and pneumonic, an airborne plague that attacks the lungs before the rest of the body, forms of the plague, which lengthen the duration of outbreaks throughout the seasons and help account for its high mortality rate and additional recorded symptoms. What are the consequences of plague? The death toll vary widely by area and from source to source as new research and discoveries come to light. It killed an estimated 200 million people in the 14th century. According to medieval historian Philip Dayleader in 2007, the trend of recent research is pointing to a figure more like 45 to 50 of the European population dying during a 4-year period. There is a fair amount of geographic variation. In Mediterranean Europe, areas such as Italy, the south of France, and Spain, where plague ran for about 4 years consecutively, it was probably closer to 75 to 80 of the population. In Germany and England, it was probably closer to 20. The most widely accepted estimate for the Middle East, including Iraq, Iran, and Syria during this time, is for a death rate of about a third. The Black Death killed about 40 of Egypt's population. Half of Paris' population of 100,000 people had died. In Italy, Florence's population was reduced from 110,000 or 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 to 50,000 in 1351. At least 60 of Hamburg's and Bremen's population perished. Before 1350, there were about 170,000 settlements in Germany, and this had been reduced by nearly 40,000 by 1450. In 1348, the plague spread so rapidly that before any physicians or government authorities had time to reflect upon its origins, about a third of the European population had already perished. In crowded cities, It was not uncommon for as much as 50 of the population to die. Europeans living in isolated areas suffered less, whereas monks and priests were especially hard hit since they cared for the Black Death's victims. Because 14th century healers were at a loss to explain the cause, Europeans turned to astrological forces, earthquakes, and the poisoning of wells by Jews as possible reasons for the plague's emergence. The governments of Europe had no apparent response to the crisis because no one knew its cause or how it spread. The mechanism of infection and transmission of diseases was little understood in the 14th century. Many people believed only God's anger could produce such horrific displays. There were many attacks against Jewish communities. In August 1349, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne were exterminated. In February of that same year, the citizens of Strasbourg murdered 2,000 Jews. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed. The Brotherhood of the Flagellants, a movement said to number up to 800,000, reached its peak of popularity.